Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the group, what we do, and why we do it. Now, on the podcast with me today is the chairperson of the group, David Walsh, and we're just going to talk about different areas that we focus on. How are you doing, David?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Well, quite well.
So let's get into it. So first off, Men's Voices Ireland. What is Men's Voices Ireland and what does the group do?
Men's Voices Ireland is a male advocacy group. It was set up in 2016 in the absence of any group which would speak out and advocate for men across a broad range of issues. While there are groups which focus on single issues, there are no groups which encompass a broad sweep of issues. This is both challenging and it's also illuminating. It's challenging because of the broad, diverse nature of the issues which are to be discussed, but it's also illuminating because there are connections between these different issues, and seeing those connections enables us to gain a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on and to make more effective interventions.
So what would be the main goals of the organisation?
Our main goals are to give voice to the problems and the sufferings of men across these different areas. We also want to look at the laws which discriminate against men, to help to undo those laws and to put in place more beneficial, more equitable legislation. A related area is the supports and services which help men. Say, for instance, men who are undergoing domestic abuse, or men who have lost access to their children through the family courts, or who have been removed from their homes. These are difficult areas, and providing good services is crucial to the well-being of these people.
Now, some would say that as men are the majority in government, that men's voices are already catered for. How would you respond to those?
Absolutely not. This is a totally naive assumption. The fact is that all the laws which have been put in place in the last 30, 40 years in social areas, they actually discriminate against men and they favour women. And this was at a time when the Dáil consisted of men, predominantly of men. So this issue, this view is not valid. As well as that, there is no male counterpart of the National Women's Council for Women. So that is why there is also a need for a group like ours.
Yeah, I think it really kind of comes down to the idea that because men are in power, that means they must be empowering men, when that may not necessarily be the case.
Absolutely not. This has been invalidated in so many different countries. It's the same across a whole range of countries. Men are in power, but yet the laws favour women. That has been the case and the experience in so many different countries.
Yeah, so now there are many different areas of men's issues that the group focuses on, but what would be the main ones that you primarily target?
Yeah, we focus on 7 key social areas: domestic abuse, family law, education, male suicide, false accusations, homelessness, and unjust laws. These are the areas that we focus on primarily. But underpinning all of these areas is the fact that there is no national representative body which would speak and advocate for men and boys across all these different areas. This is crucial. This is essential when legislation is being discussed, that before Oireachtas committees. It is essential to have a body which represents men and which can speak on behalf of men and boys at these Oireachtas committees. It is also important that to have such a body to address the media on issues of concern to men and boys, and to point out areas where the legislation does not favour men. These are all important things. By the way, I should point it out that every other interest group in the state has a national representative body, which is state funded, which has regular access to the media, and some of these groups actually have several, but all except men. They don't have any.
Alright, so now we're going to get into the different areas that Men's Voices Ireland focus on in a bit more detail. So first off, I want to talk about male victims of domestic violence. So first off, what is the current situation regarding male victims of domestic violence in Ireland?
Well, first, let me make a general comment which cuts across all these areas. The situation across all these areas is bad, full stop. But in the case of domestic abuse, the services from men are absolutely pathetic. There is only one national, there's no national service. There's only one group which attempts to provide a national service, and that is Men's Aid. In 2021, Men's Aid got exactly 1% of the funding which was provided by TUSLA for these services. 1%. There is no service in the Dublin area. There is one call centre in Navan, which is supposed to serve the country. The amount of money that, as I say, is available is extremely low, and it doesn't allow for Men's Aid to provide anything like a proper service. There are no shelters for men as well, and the official attitude is that domestic violence is something perpetrated by men and women are the victims, whereas the overwhelming evidence worldwide is that this is simply false. Domestic violence is perpetrated at similar levels by men and women across virtually all the countries in which services have been done. But this is not recognised by the state, nor is it recognised by the media, which is overwhelmingly negative.
Yeah, and I think it's not just a negative attitude towards in the media towards male victims. It's also kind of a societal attitude. Like there have been several social experiments where they've shown a man beating up a woman in public and a woman beating up a man, and yet like people always intervene to stop it when a woman is being beaten. Yet people you've seen it on some of these that they've started laughing at when a man is being beaten, and some even actually take their phones out and start filming. So it's not just in the media; it's also like society in general. So I think there's a lot of work that really needs to go into dealing with that. So what does Men's Voices Ireland what do they wish to see happen to improve the situation?
Well, we want to see a proper national service set up, which is properly funded and which has call centres in all the cities and the major towns. We also want to see these centres funded on a par with those which are present serving women. We want to see shelters for male victims set up across the country and which are on a par with those provided for women. There must also be a recognised national agency which represents men before Oireachtas committees on issues of domestic violence and which is empowered to speak to the media on these issues.
Okay, so the next area is a pretty big one, so we won't be able to go too much into detail on it, and that is family law. So what's the current situation in general with regard to family law in Ireland?
It's bad. In family law, the 1995 Act provides that the man can be removed from the home when divorce or separation occurs, and that he will struggle thereafter to both maintain himself financially and to be able to maintain a good relationship, a meaningful relationship with his children. A report on family law reform was made by the Oireachtas Justice Committee in 2019, to which Men's Voices contributed. But this report has not been implemented in law, and the situation continues to be bad. And there has been no cross-party support to have this reform carried out in law. So the situation remains, the report remains in limbo. There has been no attempt to put the recommendations into legislation, and there's been no call to do so either.
So when you say like it hasn't received cross-party support, why hasn't it, do you think?
Why hasn't it?
Why hasn't that legislation received cross-party support?
Because it's an extremely sensitive piece of legislation. It was formulated, Family Law Reform Act was formulated in the late 90s and even earlier, with the cooperation, with the mostly by women's groups, and they don't want to see this legislation undone at this point.
So what does Men's Voices Ireland want to see change with regard to family law? I know there's a lot of areas, but in kind of general, what needs to happen?
A radical reform of family law needs to be carried out, which goes beyond the recommendations of the Oireachtas report of 2019. There must be proper provision for equal and joint parenting made between the two parties, and there must also be an equitable division of the family resources when a settlement is finally being made. That requires the striking out of Section 10 of the Family Law Act 1995. And what needs to be put in place is an alternative dispute resolution system which borrows from best practice, which is now best practice in a number of countries. There is also another factor which needs to be emphasized. That is the crucial role of the father in the lives of his children. This is absolutely essential that this be taken into account, because the role of father has not been properly recognized in the legislation, and it is particularly important for boys.
Yeah, so the next area is boys in education, and I think it kind of follows on from fathers. So, what's the current situation regarding the education of boys in Ireland?
Boys have been falling behind in education for many years, and their needs are not being addressed. The teaching staff is 86% female at primary level and more than 70% female at secondary level. It is therefore not surprising that boys are often held to the sort of behaviour norms which are suitable for girls, but not suitable for boys. It also means that boys do not have role models in their lives, in their education, and they are often not encouraged to do well academically.
So,
and a number of sources, a number of studies have drawn attention to these issues, including the OECD, studies from the OECD. There has also been a study called Taking Boys Seriously, which has been carried out by 2 Northern Ireland academics, and there is also one by Warren Farrell, who is a well-known advocate for men's issues.
So, what does Men's Voices want to see happen with regard to how can we improve the situation for boys in education?
Much more attention must be paid to how boys learn. In this regard, the recommendations made by the report called Taking Boys Seriously contains some very good recommendations which need to be put into practice. In fact, one of the things they drew attention to, they found that the most important factor in learning, particularly for boys, was the teacher-pupil relationship. This is absolutely important.
Yeah, and I do remember kind of in my time in school, especially in secondary school, like there was several teachers who were really good and kind of I used as role models. So I think it's the lack of role models that are really damaging kind of boys growing up.
That's correct. Yeah, measures must also be taken to increase the number of male teachers, both at primary and secondary level, as the OECD recommends. I haven't mentioned third level, but there are differences at third level also. In third level, there are a number of areas in which females predominate. Areas such as law, medicine, education, and psychology. There can be a very large number of females as opposed to boys in these areas, and this is important also from the point of view of social policy. As well as that, women, more women have third level qualifications than men. For instance, a recent report found that about 60% of women between the ages of 24 and 34 have a third level of qualification, as opposed to 52% of men. And yet another measure of the discrepancy is that if you look at recent graduates, the number of graduates, the percentage of graduates in Ireland, third level graduates in Ireland, which are female, was 53.8% in 2017, as opposed to 46.2% for men. So this again is quite a wide gap.
So the next area we're going to look at is it's also quite a big one, but it's also one that I kind of find quite interesting, and it's false allegations of rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. So, what's the current situation regarding false allegations in Ireland?
False allegations of rape, sexual assault, and child abuse are being heard increasingly, but there is little in the way of hard data available. But in the UK in 2018, there was a storm created when it was found that 4 rape charges in quick succession were found to be false, and this was part due to the fact that evidence which was essential and crucial was not made known until the very last moment. This caused the Crown Prosecution Service to actually review all of the rape charges that were then current. More than 600 of them were reviewed, and 47 were thrown out as a result of this review. The head of the Crown Prosecution Service at that time was a woman named Alison Saunders, and it was well recognized that during that time bias was evident in the way cases were being handled.
Yeah, and like you say, while good data is lacking, it more and more examples of false allegations are kind of popping up. So it really is something that needs to be looked at, I think, quite a bit. So I think the reason why a lot of people don't look at false allegations is because a I'd say they might be maybe afraid of what they might find. So, but then it kind of does ask the question: how do you avoid false allegations? How do you kind of separate? How do you separate the supporting actual victims with then kind of rooting out the false allegations?
Well, there are a couple of factors here. Judges need to be trained. Now, the Rape Crisis Network Ireland and the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre were very quick off the blocks here, and they are now training judges and others in these cases. But their point of view cannot be said to be impartial. So there is a need for a different point of view to put to counterbalance this kind of training. There is a second factor, and that is the handling of false allegations which have been proven to be false. There must be proper prosecution of false allegations, the allegations which are known to be false, and terms of imprisonment must be imposed. But that has not happened at all. Terms of imprisonment are actually extremely rare, or non-existent, when accusations of this kind are shown to be false. And this is also the case in the UK. In fact, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK has told prosecutors that they shouldn't bring false allegation charges against a person unless they are certain, virtually certain, that there will be a conviction obtained. That is one way of dealing with it. There has to be much more serious thought put into the way false allegations are handled.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest examples of false allegations that I can recall happened a few years ago was that of Sergeant McCabe.
That's right. This was in relation to false allegation of child abuse.
Yeah.
And this was one of the most serious cases. The charges against Sergeant McCabe were made, I think, go back to 2014, and the charges were maintained for a very long period of time, even though it was becoming evident that there was no basis to them.
Yeah.
And still they were maintained. So it shows that there is a climate of opinion there, which thinks that men are actually guilty in many of these cases. We also know, for instance, that false allegations of child abuse are currently being made in the family courts in order to win a favourable outcome in the family courts. And this too needs to be tackled.
Okay, so another area that I find particularly interesting and I like focusing on for quite a bit is men's mental health and male suicide. So what's the current situation regarding men's mental health in Ireland?
Well, I prefer to talk about suicide because the figures there are much easier to grasp, and they give probably a clearer picture of what's happening. We don't actually focus on mental health because that's much more difficult to measure.
Yes,
But in regard to suicide, thankfully, the male suicide rate has been in decline since 2017. And this decline has happened generally as well. For women it has fallen as well. The male suicide ratio, which was 4-1 stubbornly for a number of years, and was even higher, reached levels close to 5-1 at one point, that has been in decline since 2017. The ratio is now closer to 3-1. We know from research in the UK that men undergoing separation or divorce are particularly at risk. They are at much higher risk than men in general. And this has to do with the outcomes in the family courts, which often make rulings which can have the effect of separating men from their children. And this can have a devastating effect on a man's life.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes against that idea that, like, a lot of dads are kind of deadbeats and they don't care about their children. When, if you actually look at the damage that being separated from your kid can cause, it definitely shows that that's not the case.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just another red herring. This is another one of those false accusations that are hurled against men. The fact that so many deadbeat dads. In fact, the figures for deadbeat dads are quite low, and yes, they have been looked at, and they have been, and that allegation has been entirely refuted, I believe. But as to what we would like to see done about male suicide, in the first place, going back to mental health, that continues to be underfunded in right across the board generally. So there needs to be a change in that respect. In regard to male suicide, I've already mentioned that men undergoing divorce or separation are particularly at risk. And this has to do with the outcomes in the family courts. So it means that changes have to be made in the way the family courts are run in order that men are not separated from their children, or that they don't find access to their children very difficult to maintain. This is one of the premier changes needed.
So, okay, so the next topic is, I will say, an interesting one, but it hasn't been one I've really looked into that much, is men with regard to homelessness. So what's the current situation around that?
This issue was clear-cut in 2016 when we started out, but it has changed since then. It has changed because of the shortage of housing, which has been taking place progressively since 2017, and which has impacted on thousands of people. So that the focus today is much more on families who cannot or who have been cut out from rental accommodation, or else families who cannot maintain a mortgage or get a mortgage in the first place. This is where the focus is now. Having said that, we do know that the great majority of rough sleepers are men. Now, these are often men who have been made homeless in the first place, either that or have lost contact with their family, or have been made unemployed. And there are virtually no services available in order to allow these men to resume their role in life, have a meaningful role in society.
So what do you think would be the best way to kind of improve that situation?
The connection between homelessness and judgments in the family courts must be properly investigated. And if there is found to be a connection, then proper measures must be put in place in order to deal with that. The situation with regard to rough sleepers, as I have said, is that they may be men who have been removed from their homes, who have lost contact with their families, or who have become unemployed, and they feel that society has lost any interest in them. There needs to be services put in place to help these homeless men or these rough sleepers to get back into society and to assume a meaningful role once again.
So going into the last subject area would be unjust laws. Now I'd say there's quite a few to list off. So what's the current situation regarding some of those unjust laws in Ireland?
Well, I've already mentioned some of them. The Family Law Act 1995 is one which discriminates against men, but there are others. The Victims of Crime Act 2017 appears to be prejudiced against the accused person and appears to favour the complainant. For example, what happened with the Victims of Crime Act 2017 was that there was a subtle change made, and the word complainant, or the term complainant, was replaced by the term victim. Now, this appears right throughout the Victims of Crime Act 2017. Now, this is a change which we believe is guaranteed to prejudice the case against the accused person by calling the other person the victim. And so that needs to change. There is a Domestic Violence Act of 2018 which provides for an emergency barring order under which a man can be removed from his home by a person who is not a spouse or a civil partner, but is a person with whom he has had what's known as, or what they call an intimate relationship, which again is not specified, which is not spelled out.
It's not properly defined.
No, it's not properly defined, which allows the man to be removed from the home while the complainant actually remains in the home for at least for a certain length of time. That too is something that must be remedied. So these are examples of some. Finally, I should mention again that there must be laws put in place to prosecute people who make false accusations, and terms of imprisonment must be handed out to those who do make them.
So, what do you want to see happen with regard to solving the problems that are caused by unjust laws, and how would you deal with the laws themselves?
Well, briefly, the unjust laws must be repealed. That is, and I've mentioned several of them already, but this will be an enormous task.
Yeah.
It will require, in my estimation, a National Men's Council to be put in place, and it will require an enormous effort by a great many men and the women who support them to do so. It will also require a change in public opinion.
Yeah.
And that means that there must be a change in the media as well. This will hopefully bring about a change in society, which will then be taken up by the political parties. And that's the way we see it. I also finally should make reference to the Istanbul Convention. This Istanbul Convention was put in place in 2019 without a word of discussion in the Oireachtas about it. There wasn't a single article in the newspapers to debate the issue. It was smuggled in by stealth, as it were, and it became law. To my mind, it is the quintessence of the kind of poisonous ideology which has informed state policy and the media in the last 30, 40 years. It needs to be thrown out.
Yeah, so yeah, I think the biggest thing with that is it's not just about dealing with the laws themselves, because there's a system that that's created those laws. So if you get rid of the laws, that system has just created more laws that are just as unjust. So it's you also have to kind of deal with the system itself.
You have to deal with public opinion.
Yeah.
You have to bring about radical change in public opinion, and this will require an enormous effort, as I say, over many, many years. It will be resisted fiercely by those groups who constantly are in the driving seat and who don't want to see these changes implemented. So it will require an enormous change.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot more that we haven't spoken about today. So how can people find out more about the organisation and the different areas that we focus on?
Well, they can do that by going to our website, mensvoicesireland.com, www.mensvoicesireland.com, where they will find an enormous amount of articles and information about the kind of work that we have been doing over the last 5 years, the submissions we have made on various issues, and success or lack of success that we've had in all that time.
So, like, how can people contact the organisation if they have a question or maybe if they want to join?
Yeah, they can use the email address mensvoicesireland@gmail.com in order to contact us. We'd be glad to hear from anybody who does.
Yeah, and Men's Voices Ireland is an organisation that relies on donations. So, how can people donate to support the work that Men's Voices Ireland does?
They will find details on the website. Look up the donate section there, and they will find details of how to make a contribution.
Right. So, when it comes to social media, there are several social media that we have. We have Facebook, which is at Men's Voices Ireland IRL, and we also have a Twitter page, which is at Men's Voices. So you can see us kind of interact and respond to different things that take place. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening to the first episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. The episodes that follow will focus more specifically on the different issues that we've mentioned in this episode. We also do hope to interview kind of different people that focus on men's issues, like with regard to domestic violence. So we do hope to interview experts, so keep an ear out for those. So yeah, I think this has been a pretty good conversation. I think it's a good way to.
I've enjoyed it, Jeff,
Yeah.
and I've been glad to be able to give voice to what men's voices are actually doing. I think this is very productive.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.